the accidentals that crop up in the middle of the piece without warning.
Oh no.
And I want to share a secret with you, and that is that a passage like this is sometimes even much easier to play than something like this. If you just look at it, it's a lot easier in the long term than trying to get really good at reading individual accidentals that just seem to come out of nowhere. Hi, this is Brett with Piano Aha. Today we want to talk about accidentals. Not the accidentals at the beginning of a piece, the key signature or the key inventory. We have a different video for that. Today we want to talk about the accidentals that crop up in the middle of the piece without warning. You might think, oh, all of these accidentals, how can I remember that? And then they're good until the end of the measure. I can't deal with this. Let me show you how to deal with it. So we have some variations on Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star here with a whole lot of accidentals, and we will use this piece to explain 5 tips about how to deal with accidentals in the middle of a piece. So the beginning of this piece sounds like this. Okay, so my first tip for you as far as reading accidentals goes is to read the middle of the accidental. The middle. So, for example, we see this sharp here. What note is that sharp referring to? Is it referring to the D here, or is it referring to the C? Look through the middle of the accidental. If you have a sharp, look through the middle here. If you have a flat, look through the middle here. If you have a natural sign, look through the middle here. If you see a line when you look through the middle, then it refers to a note on the line. If you see a space, then it refers to a note on a space. And that problem can arise when you have chords such as this, where 2 notes are very close to each other. So always look through the middle. Now, as far as the actual reading and playing of accidentals goes, my next tip for you would be to read the structure first and then the accidentals. For example, we heard this before, right? How am I reading this? My tip would be, first of all, read the structure, that is the lines and the spaces. So I just see 3 notes all on lines. So it looks sort of like maybe a caterpillar or a worm or a snowman, something like that. And that gives me every other white key. And then I have this note as well right under it. Right, so all together I have these notes here. And then I just see at the end, the notes in the middle have a sharp. Okay, so these 2 get sharps. That is faster than saying, okay, this is a C, and then that is a D that gets a sharp, and then that is, what's the name of that note? That is the name of that is an F, and that gets a sharp. It's faster to read the structure first and add the sharps or flats at the end. And my third tip for you concerns the meaning of sharps and flats. For example, let's take a look at this variation. We have a sharp here. This G sharp sounds like this. Now you could ask yourself, now why didn't they write an A flat there? They just could have just as well written an A flat, right? The thing is that whether we write a sharp or a flat also gives us a little bit information about what's about to happen. So if in the middle of the piece we raise a note, then most of the time the next note will be the note right above it. So if I have a G sharp, it will be an A. Now take a look at this variation. Here, indeed, I do have an A flat and not a G sharp. Again, you could ask, why isn't it a G sharp? Well, whenever we lower a note in the middle of a piece, the tendency is that the next note after that would be the note directly below it. So again, that flat tends to go down. So in other words, whether we write a sharp or a flat gives us some information And that is useful information because it gives us a good assumption as to what is going to happen afterwards, at least what is likely to happen, which reduces, let's say, my cognitive load. Now, my next tip for you is about a rule that you surely know about, that a flat or a sharp or an accidental, right, they're only valid until the next bar line. But the question is, how are you supposed to remember which notes have already gotten flats or sharps until the next bar line? So here's a tip for dealing with that situation. Try to see the notes as being together in a group. For example, here, if I play this here, then you notice, okay, it all makes sense. It sounds like Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. I have no problem. But imagine this scenario now. You play this, and now someone calls you on the telephone and you talk for 10 minutes, and you come back and you read this note. Now you are liable to just read, okay, well that's an A, so I'm going to play an A. And it would be the wrong note. Now, what happened? What went wrong? What went wrong is because that you were gone for 10 minutes. You weren't seeing this note in relationship to the notes before. Now, if you don't take a break in the middle of playing a measure to talk to somebody on the phone, then you're doing better, because this here is just a group where we're wiggling from this note, we're wiggling up to that one, and wiggling right back. So the fact that this note is just the same note that we were just at is not a coincidence, right? That's, I would imagine, why this rule even exists. Because most of the time, if you have an accidental in a measure, it's going, the composer is also going to want to have that same accidental refer to the later notes in that same measure, because they're all in relationship to each other, right? This is just wiggling back and forth. So in other words, if you think about this as a whole, as some sort of group, then it will make more sense to you as to why that note still has a flat. Now, my last tip that I want to give you is for dealing with situations where we don't just have a fleeting accidental, but where we have a bunch of accidentals that stay, let's say, for the long haul. So let's take a look at an example. If we take this, for example, I have a couple of what I'll call fleeting accidentals. This G sharp here and this D sharp here, I'll play it for you. You'll hear that they're just sort of there. They're sort of a pretty transition to get to the next note, but they never happen again, right? Right? This G sharp was just sort of on the way up to the A, and this D sharp just sort of led into the E, and we can forget about those afterwards. They both have a natural sign afterwards, because they weren't there for the long haul. They were just sort of there to get to the next note. Maybe they sounded good, and that's it. Now that's one situation. But the situation I want to talk about is a different situation. One like this, where you look at a couple of measures and there are just so many accidentals there, and you think to yourself, I can never remember that. That makes no sense to my brain. Why does this one have an accidental and then this one doesn't? And this one looks like it doesn't, but it really does, because that one is still valid until it's just too much. And I want to share a secret with you, and that is that a passage like this is sometimes even much easier to play than something like this. If you just look at it once. Once and for all, we want to figure out what piano keys do we need there, right? Okay, use these notes. If you know a little bit more, you might say, oh, we're in the key of D flat major. Or you could just say, I have these piano keys. And even in the left hand, I'm taking them from the same group of piano keys, right? Once I figure out that the piano keys that I need, right, are just these, I don't need to read these accidentals anymore. I just need to remember, what do I have? I have the black keys, and whenever I have a choice between white ones here, I'm going to pick the one on the right, or the one that's higher. And starting now, I just read the notes as the way they go up and down. It's going down, going down, going down, and going down. So by defining a local inventory, so an inventory of piano keys that I'm going to be using, by defining that, I make my job easier. I don't have to read individual notes, but I just remember what inventory I'm taking all my notes from and don't really even read the accidentals anymore. So, what's the takeaway here? The takeaway is to deal with accidentals that come in the middle of the piece, you need to see them as being part of something bigger, part of a group, part of some larger area that makes sense. In other words, we don't want to be looking at these as individual notes, but part of a bigger whole. For example, when I said first read the structure and then add the accidentals, what were we doing? The structure means we have something that is comprised of several notes, and then we're just adding the accidentals as a detail. Or when we made a local inventory, what we did is we used the accidentals to make up an entire area of measures where we knew exactly which piano keys we needed, and then just thought we're playing up and down within that area. That's a lot easier in the long term than trying to get really good at reading individual accidentals that just seem to come out of nowhere. Be that as it may, thank you for watching this video, and happy AHA.